patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 121 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Talassi. Thank you all so much for joining me for this solo program. Hope you're all doing well, that you are excited for the beginning of summer coming up in just a few weeks, or I guess for some people, summer has already started. Before we get to our episode, as a kind reminder, if this is the first time you're listening to the program, and if you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens to get notifications when episodes are newly released. Be sure to share it with your friends, family, co-workers, and anyone who may be interested in this show. I really appreciate all of the support, especially from the Patreon supporters. I want to especially thank. They truly deserve a lot of credit for the success and the operations of this show. And there's going to be more information about Patreon and some of the new changes that we're going to be implementing so that we can not only recognize the Patreon supporters who are supporting this program, but also open up new doors for people to be able to support the program in more ways. From the beginning of Friends and Fellow Citizens, we have really explored all these different topics of patriotism, of education, of civility, fiscal responsibility, and others. But what are the kinds of root causes that are prompting us to think about these? Certainly those 6 principles of patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, and civility came originally from the Washington Farewell Address in 1796. But how do we make that connection between the document and today? That has been a fundamental question that we've been trying to answer here on the show. I want to now go something deeper into a story that is actually more recent, sometime in the middle of the 20th century. I came out with this idea recently when I was doing a guest lecture in front of a class I'm assisting with this semester, and I accidentally asked a question that is probably about as deep as you can get when it comes to the study of politics, which is, how bad is polarization nowadays? And this is a very, very tough question that we have to tackle, because on the one hand, we are promoting civility here on this program, and something I want more people in our politics today to practice. But on the other hand, one can't really define or even promote civility without defining some kind of context. When we speak about polarization, it's not the same polarization during the Civil War. It wasn't the same polarization as between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. It's not the same polarization when it came to the debates on civil rights. So where can we find at least one source of polarization that a lot of people would agree, at least in this day and age, could be an indicator of why we are here today in this very polarized society where we're living in now? I thought about a topic that I covered when I was at the Bush School, and this was about 3 to 4 years ago. And I actually found the notes, class notes that I wrote up in that class about intelligence. And it was one of my favorite classes at the time of the Bush School. And there was a case that I think really should be taught in every single school in America, especially for those who are interested in why America is polarized as it is today. The story needs some background here. In the 1930s and the 1940s, just in the wake of World War II, even beforehand, during the war, and even after the war, there were all these concerns about communist infiltration. You had politicians running around saying there's nothing going on. You have politicians running around saying there's a lot going on. Every single department is completely not aware of what's going on with our espionage and our intelligence services. And this chaos, really, this mess, it came from the idea that America was not going to get involved in espionage for decades and decades. Even though Washington helped spearhead that initial start for espionage and for intelligence, many presidents and many Congresses really shied away from espionage. This was obviously before the McCarthy era. So McCarthy era was in the 1950s, but in the 1930s and 1940s, there's still active pushes by the Soviet Union, which was considered an ally at the time, to promote communism in schools, in different areas of American culture, in perhaps in movies and television. So there were people who were sympathizers to communism. Now, this is not the same thing as being a spy, of course, right? Because a spy, you're really passing out intelligence, you're doing all these things. That's very different from a sympathizer, which is very different from maybe a communist member. It was just there's a conglomerate of a lot of different players at the time. And there was a woman named Elizabeth Bentley. She was a former communist, and she decided to start speaking out. When she left the Communist Party, she decided to turn against that ideology that she used to love. And she one time named one member of a former Communist Party USA member and named Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers was a short, stocky man, not from a very affluent family at all. Education, he was actually a dropout, born in Philadelphia, but grew up in Brooklyn. And Chambers was an interesting guy. He was an editor at a newspaper in the early 1940s, but beforehand he was a member of the Communist Party. And he wasn't just a member. It wasn't just like he was just showing up and eating donuts over there, but he was really trying to be involved in the operations of the Communist Party USA and what it stood for. Chambers decided that communism was bad, that it wasn't the ideology that is good for America. And so when he left the Communist Party, he decided to do everything he could to ensure that communism wouldn't spread. And he found himself in perhaps one of the craziest trials of all time. It was a trial not just in terms of the trial in the courts, but it was really a trial on ideologies. He found himself right smack in the middle of Washington, D.C., in what is known as the Hiss Chambers hearings. Now, just as a disclaimer, this case is very, very complex and very multifaceted. There's people saying this and that, or he said, she said. So I'm going to condense it down to something that is going to be easy to understand, a good summary of what happened, but we're going to also get some of those lessons that I think are very valuable to understanding the Hiss Chambers hearings and what was to come afterwards, even all the way to the present day. On August 3rd, 1948, Whittaker Chambers appeared in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is known as HUAC. HUAC was tasked to investigate communist infiltration in the U.S. government and really just the United States in general. So it was kind of a combination of, kind of the element of hopefully using soft power to persuade people to not join the Communist Party or to have communist views. It was also a bit of a security committee as well, because it really tried to crack down on what the implications were for U.S. national security. Chambers appears before the committee, and he tells them a little story. First, Chambers described how he tried to warn the federal government about communist infiltration back in 1939. So just 9 years ago, he claimed that he was already starting to do what he wanted to do, which is to be a patriot, to support his country. And he named a particular group of individuals who were especially central to being part of not just a communist sympathizing group, but also one that was involved in more deeper in ideas of espionage and of covert operations. It wasn't officially an intelligence group, but it was a group of individuals who wanted to do what they can to support the communist cause. And this group was known as the Weir Group. It was named after the leader Henry Weir. Chambers claimed that there was one individual in that group who, at that time, around the hearings, was the head of the Carnegie Endowment. This individual was a former State Department employee and someone who had very, very high rankings in government during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, including being at the Yalta Conference where they discussed post-war plans for Germany and the rest of Europe. This member that Chambers names is named Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was discussed briefly for the past several years as potentially someone who was a communist sympathizer in government, but there just wasn't a lot of traction about the discussion of Hiss as someone who was a communist sympathizer and someone who was really that influential in the policy-making process in Washington, D.C. Hiss was a very handsome guy, very well-educated from the East Coast, and probably seemed likable by a lot of people. And when Hiss learns about this accusation from this man in Whittaker Chambers, Hiss tells the HUAC chairman, that time was J. Parnell Thomas, tells Chairman Thomas that, I don't even know this guy. I don't know what this guy's talking about. I've never heard of him. I've never met him. Chambers has absolutely no basis whatsoever for his accusations. Now, what potentially probably would have been one of the dumbest things to do, especially when you're in this situation, is that when Hiss actually told Chairman Thomas that he wanted to appear in front of HUAC to defend himself. And while it's understandable that people want to defend themselves, especially on an accusation, you're inviting a lot of media attention here. And this is exactly what happened. As much as there was media attention on Chambers at the beginning, all of a sudden this started really picking up as an interesting story for the media and for Congress. So later in August, Hiss shows up and he once again claims that he does not know this man named Whittaker Chambers. Chambers, on the other hand, is saying not only do they know each other, but they were actually pretty close. And that Hiss was actually a very, very devout communist. So you had a lot of back and forth here. And one of the issues, though, was that when Hiss was testifying in front of Congress, remember I said that this is all about characterization too. The problem for Chambers was that he just didn't look that great compared to Hiss. Hiss was this clean and articulate man, and Chambers just kind of looked like some guy you just kind of found on the street. And when Hiss defends himself, there was the feeling amongst viewers, amongst the media, and perhaps politicians that, oh, this guy, Hiss, knows what he's talking about. That we shouldn't really spend a whole lot of time discussing whether or not this guy from Philadelphia knows this guy from Baltimore. But it came down to one congressman on that committee who was determined to use this opportunity to figure out not only what was going on, but to perhaps advance something even greater when it came to political goals, personal goals, but perhaps something larger to the larger fight against communism, which he firmly believed in. That congressman was a congressman from California, Richard Nixon. Heard of him before? Well, Richard Nixon at the time was a very, very clever congressman. He was always a very shrewd politician, regardless of what you think of his views and what you think of his policies. But he was known to be very, very shrewd and very smart. He decides that he is going to try and take on this case of figuring out which man, Chambers or Hiss, which man was lying. And he also wanted to figure out a bit more about the story. And figure out, as a congressman, he wanted to not only figure out what was best for his ideology and for what he believed for the United States, but he actually found Chambers to be quite convincing. And so the committee's like, okay, all right, well, Nixon's making such a big deal out of this, so we'll make him the chair of the subcommittee, and he's going to determine who is lying, Hiss or Chambers. Now, Hiss has claimed that he doesn't know Chambers. That was his initial argument. And what the committee does is that they show a photograph of Chambers and they ask him, do you recognize this man? And then Hiss kind of changes his tune a little bit. And he says, well, he actually kind of looks familiar. I know that there was this man who I knew. This is Hiss speaking, right? He's like, I know there's this man back in the 1930s who actually rented his apartment. So Hiss had basically sublet his apartment to this man named George Crosley. And one of the things that he had is that he had really bad teeth. Apparently, that was one of the few things that he remembered. Hiss remembered about this so-called man named George Crosley. Crosley was a man who claimed that he was a freelance writer, and that Hiss actually had given him an old car, which sounds pretty nice, sounds really charitable. And so Hiss is going on this line of saying, this man looks familiar. I think it might be George Crosley, the man who I helped out a lot. Now this gets interesting because not only is Hiss changing his story a little bit, but now Chambers is going to not only be part of this hearing process even further, but that the committee and really Hiss himself. He said, I want both of us to testify at the same time. And that's exactly what they did on August 17th, 1948. This I think, is a unique exchange here between Hiss and Chambers. Hiss asked, did you ever go under the name of George Crosley? Chambers replied, not to my knowledge. Hiss asked then again, did you ever sublet an apartment on 29th Street from me? Chambers said, no, I did not. And Hiss asked, you did not? Chambers said, no. Then Hiss asked again, did you ever spend any time with your wife and child in an apartment on 29th Street in Washington when I was not there because I and my family were living on P Street? And then Chambers replied, I most certainly did. Hiss asked, wait, you did or did not? Chambers said, I did. Then Hiss asked, well, would you tell me how you reconcile your negative answers with this affirmative answer? And then Chambers replied, very easily, Alger. I was a communist and you were a communist. It's these kinds of exchanges that not only brought about a rivalry between the two, or at least so it seemed, but imagine the audience in 1948, the first ever televised congressional hearing, with two men who are claiming that one is clearly lying, the other is telling the truth. And the fact that no one really knows who is telling the truth. I mean, this got to be immediately a spectacle that just probably blew everyone's mind at the time. Certainly the tough times that people were going through, especially in the post-war era, when there were a lot of questions about communism and the role of the United States after World War II. This is certainly a very, very important time for all this to happen. Now, going back to with Nixon decided to really get on this case, and he interviewed Chambers. And the goal for Nixon was to interview Chambers to see how well he knew Alger Hiss. And one of the questions that Nixon and the committee asked Chambers was, okay, well, what hobbies did Mr. Hiss have? And Chambers said, yes, he and his wife really liked bird watching. And there's this particular kind of bird. It's like a yellow bird. Well, that's not the way he said it, but he described this bird. I can't remember the name of it, but he said that one time Hiss and his wife just really, really loved this bird that they saw. And he gave them the name of that bird. Coming back to the committee hearing, one of the congressmen named John McDowell on the HUAC committee asked Alger Hiss, and he asked, what kind of hobbies do you like? And Hiss like, well, I like tennis, and I actually like seeing birds. And he was asked again, do you like insert this particular kind of bird? Have you seen one recently? And Hiss said, yeah, absolutely. I've seen this bird before, right in Washington, D.C. I don't know about you, but I think as a watcher, certainly if you're on the Chambers side, if you're Richard Nixon, you really feel like just purely based on this little known fact on someone's hobby, you feel like you really got a case that not only does Chambers know Hiss, but you are convinced that Hiss knows Chambers very well. And this is something that no investigator, I think, could really be able to dig up, to be able to make up something like this. The cameras obviously were continuing to roll with all this talk about where these hearings were going. And it was really after these huge statements, including Chambers publicly calling Hiss a communist on Meet the Press, that's when Hiss really starts to officially go after Chambers with a lawsuit against this so-called man named George Crosley. Now, Chambers was thinking, okay, well, this is an opportunity for me to really bring this thing to explode on the news, and also really explode in the larger conversation about the hearings and about the state of communist infiltration. So Chambers he basically added on to his arguments and said, it's not just that I know Alger Hiss, it's not just the fact that we know each other very well and that we were close before, but that Hiss is actually a spy. Because one thing that you have to know is that Chambers was actually a courier for the Soviets and for the Communist Party. A courier being someone who was like the middleman for exchanging messages and especially intelligence. And so on November 17, 1948, Chambers goes back to his home and he pulls out an envelope. And in this envelope contains 65 pages of retyped State Department documents. What the last one, I think, was from 1938, I believe, somewhere based in the late 1930s, just before Chambers left the party and started warning authorities in 1939. And part of these documents was the type pages plus 4 notes that were written in Alger Hiss's handwriting. And Chambers goes around and he says, this is what Hiss tried to give me when I was a courier. And this is proof that not only did we know each other, but that he tried to pass along intelligence to the Soviets. Now, Chambers had to kind of change some dates here, which is really interesting. He claimed that he left the party in 1937, but now it was like 1938. I guess this just wasn't really picked up by members of Congress. But it's certainly interesting how there's a lot of some changing of the arguments of the lines. It's like the two men knew maybe from the press coverage of what was happening. I mean, earlier Hiss thought that he and the press and the politicians were all on his side. And then all of a sudden the tide just changes. So this really becomes that game frame coverage that people didn't sign up for, but that America was just watching so intently as this slowly came about. But on December 2nd of 1948, Chambers tells HUAC, saying, okay, I'm going to show you something. So he takes these HUAC people to a pumpkin patch on his farm in Maryland, near Westminster, Maryland, and he showed them a pumpkin that was hollowed out. And this pumpkin was to hold the 5 rolls of 35 millimeter film that he claimed that Hiss gave to him in 1938. The film contained images of very, very classified State Department documents. And so these items, together along with the papers I just mentioned, were known as the Pumpkin Papers. This is really the first time now that you're having concrete, materials being shown and being presented in this Hiss Chambers hearing saga. And this just absolutely changes everything now. Because while Hiss, if he were to be caught as a spy, his statute of limitations would have been only 5 years at that time. The real issue for Hiss in this case was that because he had made all these statements, claimed that he didn't know any about any of this, or didn't even know Chambers for that matter, and he would actually be setting himself up for charges of perjury. And that is exactly what happened. Hiss was charged with 2 counts of perjury. There was no indictment for espionage, as I mentioned earlier. Chambers was actually never charged, even though he probably could have been charged with perjury as well. I've got a feeling that it probably has something to do with the politics that between him and perhaps Richard Nixon. Not necessarily claiming that there was like a secret deal or anything, but Hiss is kind of the main target here, right? Like the main person who is really, really being talked about, because Chambers is, his whole stance is like, hey, I'm just telling you what's going on. I'm not the one spying. I'm not the one, passing along, rolls of film into pumpkins. And so Hiss really becomes that center for attention when it came to the trial. The grand jury charged him with those 2 counts of perjury. And throughout this time, there even at different points, even after Hiss made that first statement saying that he didn't know Whittaker Chambers, people like Harry Truman even came in and said that this is basically like a nothing burger. There were some other people, even Supreme Court justices and other politicians, members of Congress, and just everyday Americans who started to become divided against one another. That they couldn't even find any sort of single common ground on the facts. In 1950, the judge sentenced Hiss to 5 years imprisonment on each of those 2 counts. Hiss only served for just several months though, and it was actually subsequently released for good behavior. And this really became the ending point for what was an intense and just very, very bitter set of hearings and sequence of events for American politics for years to come. It was obviously a win for Richard Nixon because obviously he used part of this platform to really sell himself as a viable candidate. In fact, he was so viable that President Eisenhower, who was staunchly very much in that fight against communism, selected Richard Nixon as his vice presidential candidate. And Nixon obviously used that very, very well in terms of his ability to eventually be the Republican nominee for president in 1960 and ultimately be elected to president in 1968 and 1972. It was obviously a big boon for other future prominent leaders, including Barry Goldwater, President Ronald Reagan, and it really set up this idea that America was not just engaged in a set of congressional hearings. This was something much larger, that this was a fight for the ideals of America. And I don't think this divide that started and I don't think it started with the Hiss Chambers hearings, but I don't think the divisions were just partisan. I think it actually cut through party lines in a lot of ways. What the Alger, Hiss, and Whittaker Chambers hearings showed was that American politics was, first of all, was to be broadcast. The first major broadcast for these contentious hearings changed the way that people probably saw the congressional process. It represented the people who wanted to fight for ideals of freedom and of anti-communism, and the other side of really the Hiss side of saying that the Hiss was innocent and that all these allegations are probably some kind of part of this conspiracy of really just setting him up as a victim. For decades and decades, even after imprisonment, Hiss continued to claim that he was innocent. Chambers actually wrote a very, very good autobiography called Witness in 1952. And what Chambers was actually posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Ronald Reagan. The Hiss and his family, again, had a very, very strong group of supporters. Probably wasn't that huge, but it represented obviously the other side of this ideological divide. What really, really, I think, undermined Hiss after he left prison was something called the release of the Venona papers, which were a series of interceptions in State Department intelligence that were starting to be declassified. And these definitively, I cannot think of something more definitive than the Venona papers of clearly outlining that Alger Hiss was a Soviet spy. That he was actively trying to help the Soviets with those documents and with those tapes. This divide, as I've really recapped with the story, as you can probably tell, this was a very, very complex set of hearings. It was one that it was for the ages. When you think about the congressional process, when you see footage from a contentious congressional hearing, when you think about the big committee hearings that you've heard about or you've read about, maybe you've seen on firsthand, including the Watergate hearings, including the hearings on Iran-Contra, hearings on the Benghazi scandal, about Hillary Clinton, perhaps about some of the hearings of January 6th as well. I would say that the root cause of these contentious shouting matches that you see in congressional hearings and maybe to some degree on the House floor too. I'd be curious to learn more about how those dynamics worked back in the 1940s, 1950s. I would say the root causes, or if you were to find an origin of where that was popularized, I think I would argue that the Hiss Chambers hearings really, really started in an unfortunate era of broadcast politics fireworks that to this day I don't think has done much for our civics. I think it's really taken us backwards in a lot of ways. While there's obviously, I think, the value of fighting for those values of freedom and of being able to go after the enemies, particularly with the Soviet Union and with Nazi Germany before, and nowadays about the Putin regime and the Chinese Communist Party, those are the new enemies of today. Instead of maybe focusing just on partisan politics or just on putting out a show, I think the real question, especially one of the big takeaways we should come out of this, is not only on the ideological differences, not only recognizing that there are ideological differences, but realize that we need to work better, to do a better job of defining and protecting those fundamental values and rights that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights and in the U.S. Constitution. want to leave now with just some final remarks here and some reflections on the Hiss Chambers hearings. It's really one of my favorite topics to discuss because they're so complex. It's so many twists and turns that I didn't even mention in my summary, but it really encapsulates a lot of what American politics really is, perhaps. The first is obviously the hearings. I think really should be studied as part of the curriculum on American politics today. I first learned about these hearings in graduate school, and I thought to myself, I was talking to a friend of mine. I said, I should have learned about this in high school. I mean, this is the kind of material that you don't need to learn maybe too much in depth, but my goodness, how is it that in this day and age, with the kind of media environment that we have, how is it that so many people don't know about these hearings? We should be doing a better job, I think, as a nation, as for schools, to tell people about the Hiss Chambers hearings. I'm sure it's going to be contentious, especially in the higher levels of education in college, when people start forming their own opinions about what they think of the hearings and the dynamics of those hearings. But I think it needs to be a part of, again, that American history curriculum that is essential for understanding American civics. The second thing is the hearings, I think represent the lasting impact of division and of polarization that may not effectively just go away, disappear right away. But we can always, I think, make strides to mitigate certain divisions, but at least form relationships, at least form bonds with others who we might disagree with. What's interesting about the hearings is that Chambers actually said that he actually doesn't hate Hiss, but he remarked saying he represents really the hidden enemy that we're all trying to fight against. I thought that was a very interesting quote and something that probably wasn't covered maybe as much as some people would have thought, but it goes deeper into, like, we need to do a better job of fighting ideologies, fighting that battle of ideas. And instead of just going about and just say, oh, I hate everybody who's got a D next to their name or an R next to their name, instead focus on winning that battle of ideas, because that persuasion is ultimately what's going to keep people going and to ensure that we have an America that is built on foundations of freedom, opportunity, and of justice. I'll read a quote from Chambers' memoir, Witness. I thought that was a very profound quote. He was discussing the two faiths that he said were basic clash of one another, the faith of communism and the faith of freedom. He said, quote, two faiths were on trial, and human societies, like human beings, live by faith and die when faith dies. It's a great connection back to faith, one of the pillars of Washington's farewell address, and the importance of having sincere belief in the freedoms of America. This is what we really need to cherish. And while the hearings obviously are just one element of the many elements of history that we should reflect on, but this quote, I think, really sums up the task that we have ahead of ourselves. Maybe it's not necessarily just battle of ideologies. It's a battle of faiths. How committed are people willing to just demonstrate through their actions? And how much commitment do we have for the wealth and the health of our democracy and of the trajectory of where the United States can go and where it should go? And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this episode about the Hiss Chamber hearings and the Alger Hiss trial. I hope you enjoyed and you learned something a little bit from the middle 20th century America. Again, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our show. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your month. We will see you at the next episode. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.